This is Crystal Perez. Today is February 1st, 2012. I'm interviewing David Scott in Atlanta, Georgia for the DeKalb History Center. Mr. Scott is a former vice president of Scottdale Mill. During which years did the mill operate?
The mill began operation in July of 1901, and we announced closing in February of 1982, and it took us until into May of 1982 to run the stock out of the mill.
Okay. During which years were you at the mill?
I was employed full-time at the mill from May of 1958 until 1984, 85. I was the one appointed to liquidate it and shut it down.
Okay.
But I had worked there in the summers starting when I was 16, which would have been 1951.
So the mill, it would be safe to say that the mill was a part of your life since a very young age?
And before that, my father was president of the mill, and so it was a part of my growing up. I lived on a hill, and I could see the mill from my home, so it was a part of my life from my earliest days.
Your great-grandfather, George Washington Scott, is the founder of the mill?
George Washington Scott was the provided the financing for the mill, and he gave the money for the stock, 1/5 to each of his 5 children. So his 5 children were the original owners, but he put 100% of the money into it. And my grandfather was his only son. He had 4 daughters. So my grandfather owned 20% of the stock. And he had 6 children. So my father owned 3.fraction% of the stock. And I have a brother and sister, so I owned a little over 1% of the stock. Everybody said that I was the owner of the mill. I think I bought another 1%, and I had 2 or 2.5% of the stock.
Oh, okay.
Never more than that.
Did you know George Washington Scott?
He died in 1903, and I was born in 1935, so I didn't know him.
Okay. Did you hear about him growing up?
Oh, yes.
What are some of the things that you heard about him?
Well, he was a man home educated by his mother, who educated him primarily with the Bible. And he was a man of principle and integrity, and he obviously was very intelligent, but he worked hard, and whatever he committed himself to, he followed through. His word was more important than his wealth. His mother was an immigrant from a Scottish-Irish immigrant from Ireland. Left Ireland at the age of 16. Came with her widowed mother and a sister on a sailing ship. Her sister died at sea and was buried at sea. And she came at the age of 16 into Pennsylvania and in central, a small town, Pennsylvania, Alexandria, and within a few years married a widower with 4 children, who had 4 children, and she bore him 7 children. So the impact of his mother went with him throughout his life, although he left home at the age of 20, just a month or so after the death of his father. He came south, started a plantation in Florida. When the Civil War broke out, he joined the ranks of his adopted South, became eventually a colonel. His friends ran him for governor of Florida, and he was not elected. Some say he had a majority of votes, but he was not allowed to take office during the transition after the Civil War. Some say he lost the election of 1868. He then moved to Savannah and started a business in, I think, exporting cotton. His partner through questionable activities caused the company to go broke. The yellow fever epidemic occurred. His brother died from yellow fever, and he moved to Atlanta and began in real estate at the time that Atlanta was recovering from the Civil War. He built a fertilizer plant and made a fortune from fertilizer and sold the plant. From his wealth, he went back to Savannah and paid off everybody that he hadn't been able to pay off when he had to go into bankruptcy with interest.
Wow.
Debts that he had been forgiven by law. And he sold the fertilizer business. He took the money and built and started Agnes Scott College. And he had it named in honor of his mother, who was the influence on him throughout his life. He also used part of his wealth and invested in Scottdale Mills and died 2 years after Scottdale Mills was operating. And his son, George Booker Scott, operated it for 20 years and died. And my father became president. My father, Julius Scott, became president in 1920 and was president until probably 1970, where his nephew became president. And I was working under my cousin, Hansford Sams, Hansford, Sams. I can give you a little write-up on George Washington Scott.
That would be great. That's actually very impressive. I learned a lot that I did not know before in my research. And not only was Mr. Scott significant to DeKalb history, Decatur history, he was also significant in Southern American history.
Well, if you will look on any automobile map, if you'll look 15 miles south of Tallahassee, it will show a historical site called the Battle of Natural Bridge. if you go down there, there's a granite obelisk that mentions the generals and the other people of this battles, but it'll say that Colonel George Washington Scott set the strategy and led the battle. It said he didn't have enough troops, and he went and took all the students in a seminary in Tallahassee to help man the lines. But he blocked the advance of the Union troops who had come down the Mississippi River into the Gulf and landed at St. Mark's Lighthouse and were coming up to invade Tallahassee. And he figured out where they would come and set up the defenses and defeated them, and it's the only southern capital that was never invaded by the Yankee armies.
Wow, thank you. It's wonderful, wonderful information. Do you know who built or designed the mill?
The mill was financed by George Washington Scott and built at his initiative, but his son would have been the primary one managing the construction. They would have had an engineering company that designed and built mills, and they would have hired people to do that. My understanding is a sawmill was set up on the site, and since buildings weren't constructed from steel at that time, they cut down pine trees and sawed them up on the site and built the structure of the mill from wooden beams, some of them 12 by 14 inches. There was no electricity, so it was powered by steam. Also, I've discovered that George Washington Scott was the first person to use steam power in Florida, which was very flat and therefore had no waterfalls to power anything by water power. But he used steam to power grain mills and sawmills and was the first person to do it in Florida. So he'd had some experience in his early life in steam power. They built the factory along a small, very small creek, was able to run a water piping system to raise the water above the creek to fill a pond. Very ingenious way to get a pond when there was no waterfall.
Right.
And the remnants of that system are still there. So the coal came in on a railroad track. The coal dropped from the bottom of a car through a trestle, and men shoveled it into wheelbarrows and rolled it into the boiler and shoveled it into the boiler. And some of those men worked with me, and they had barrel chests like NFL football players.
That's amazing.
And the mill operated one 12-hour shift when it started up because there were no electric lights. They had lots of windows, and the air conditioning was to let the wind blow through the mill and take the heat out.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that you grew up around the mill.
Mm-hmm.
Where did you attend school?
I attended school at Glenwood Grammar School in Decatur, Georgia, and then Avondale High School for 2.5 years. And then for half of my junior year and my senior year, I went to a boarding school near Orlando, Florida.
Oh, okay. And you came back home to go to Georgia Tech?
Yes, I went to a liberal arts school up near Chicago and then I majored in chemistry, and I transferred to Georgia Tech in 1955 and majored in textile manufacturing.
Why did you decide to major in textile manufacturing besides the obvious reason?
I found that my abilities and gifts were in the scientific area. I enjoyed physics and chemistry. Had great difficulty with literature and history, and it just after coming out of the Army, I was in the Corps of Engineers in the Army, and trained in the Rangers in the Army, and I realized that my gifts were to make things and solve problems.
Well, that would be working at a mill.
Mm-hmm.
You started at Georgia Tech in 1955. When did you end your studies?
I graduated in 1957.
1957.
Went into the Army briefly, and then came out, and in 58 went to work at the mill.
Okay, and how was campus life during the years that you were there at Georgia Tech?
Well, first thing to say that at Georgia Tech there were 6,000 male students and 6 female students.
Wow, 6.
And I lived at home and drove the 9 miles back and forth to school. And my campus involvement in activity was primarily in a Christian organization called InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which I found very significant and beneficial to me. And in later years ended up on the national board of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. I was taking 25 credit hours a semester at Georgia Tech, and there was not much time for campus life and activity other than this one activity. But I took from 23 to 25 credit hours for 4 semesters.
Wow. So you're right, you didn't have much time for other things. Are you currently an active alumnus?
Not particularly.
Okay.
I make contributions, but not much else involved, but little other involvement.
What kinds of changes have you witnessed at Georgia Tech, especially considering that you were still active with that organization?
Well, besides the fact that I may not be able to qualify to get in today, back at that time, the state required Georgia Tech to accept every Georgia student who had taken and successfully passed the courses required for entrance to Georgia Tech.
Well, that is a significant change.
And when we entered Georgia Tech, we all gathered in an old gymnasium. And the first talk to us about the realities of Georgia Tech was that there was a person sitting on our right and left. That made 3 of you. 1 of you won't be here by Easter. So, whereas they could not select students for enrollment, they had other ways of selecting the students that they felt capable of receiving their education.
I see.
And we used to joke about Georgia Tech was a long building with no windows stretching from Atlanta to Columbus. And there were little holes in the building with conveyors going out, and you could go from Atlanta to Columbus and see these students being thrown out on these conveyors to end up in Fort Benning.
So that's pretty much how it went back then.
It was an engineer factory, and in those days, they were training high-level engineers and design people, but they were also training technicians to operate the factories in Georgia and around the country. Today, Georgia Tech does very little in training the technical people and focuses on the higher level design and inventions and developments. And Southern Polytech in Kennesaw would probably be and the community colleges around the state would be more likely the source of the technical operators, such as I was in that day. So that would be probably the biggest change today. Georgia Tech's graduate school is almost as big as its undergraduate school, and the emphasis at Georgia Tech is on the graduates, and the undergraduates are primarily being prepared for graduate school.
Right. Do you feel...
And about 45% of Georgia Tech today are women.
Right. But do you feel that your studies at Georgia Tech prepared you for your work at the mill?
Yes, it was designed exactly for that. Yeah, I could have taken textile engineering, textile chemistry, or textile manufacturing. I took textile manufacturing and spent my life related to that. I think my shortcomings at Georgia Tech were I was ill prepared for managing people. I was very prepared for all the mechanical and scientific challenges, but the management of people was my most difficult area.
They must have realized that, because I noticed that now they do have business programs there.
They had industrial management in those days, which were for people that really wanted industrial management, but largely for the football players.
We won't go into that. How would you describe your family's socioeconomic status as a result of the mill?
Well, my immediate family, or the family of the descendants of George Washington Scott, I'm going to address this initially as most of the descendants of George Washington Scott, and then I'll deal with myself and my brother, my father and his 3 children. We certainly were raised in the upper echelons of Southern society. However, you can do your research and you will not find a single descendant of George Washington Scott who is extremely wealthy and living off of inherited stock. No family was permitted to work in the mills who did not get a technical education, or an education that would prepare them to contribute to the factory operation.
So there was no nepotism, basically?
None. And there were not many family working in the mill for that reason. There were, in my days, there were, well, in the life of the, in the 80-year history of Scottdale Mills, there was only only 6 descendants of George Washington Scott who worked there, and one of them for only a couple of years, so that's down to 5, and another one moved to Georgia Dutton Cordage Mill spent his life there, so that gets it down to 4. So George Washington Scott's son, George Booker Scott, my father, James Julius Scott, and his nephew, Hansford Sams, and myself would be the only descendants of George Washington Scott that were that prepared themselves and were allowed to work there.
Now, did you say his nephew Sams?
Mm-hmm.
Did he go to work at another mill? Is that what you said?
No, his my father's brother Milton Scott
Okay.
Went to work at Georgia Dutton Cornish Mill and eventually bought controlling interest in it and spent from 1920 until 1988 at the mill. He worked there for 68 years. He lived to be 106.
Wow. Now, how did he manage to be at another mill instead of the family mill?
Well, it was still a family mill. Scottdale Mills began operating in July of 1901. As I had told you, George Washington Scott gave as a gift 1/5 of the stock to each of his 5 children.
Right.
Only one of whom was a man. The other daughters were all married. One of the daughters' husbands insisted that she demand her money out of the mill. And he went up the railroad track about a mile to build a mill and run it as he thought a mill should be run.
I see.
And within a couple of years, he was nearly broke. And George Booker Scott, who was running Scottdale, went up and tried to help save his sister's money. And so he was running both mills, and when his youngest son, Milton Scott, came back from 18 months in France in the First World War, when my father, Julius Scott, who had finished 3 years at the University of Georgia, had lung problems and went out into the southwestern territories, into what's now New Mexico, and this is before New Mexico was a state. And he and his brother Robert became cowboys. But there was a heavy drought out there. It was hard to get a job as a cowboy, but they got a few jobs briefly, and then they started working on building a dam in what's now southern New Mexico. And when he came back from his cowboy days in the western lands before New Mexico was a state, his father put him to running a dairy farm. And after a few years, the government came and said they thought the cows had tuberculosis, but they had a cure. 1 lead bullet in the head of every cow, which was an instant liquidation of the dairy at no compensation. And so he went to try to help his father, George Booker Scott, get the duck mill started. And about 10 years later, George Booker Scott died. My father, with this experience in Georgia Duck, went to Scottdale. His brother, who had been back a year and a half from France, went to the duck mill to run it and eventually bought the stock. My father worked in the duck mill, had a cot in the office, worked day and night, trying to make a profit. And in the 3rd year, he broke it to the black, and I don't remember the exact dollar amount, but it was like for the entire year, he had made 37 cents. But it was in the black for the first time.
Okay. Was there a golden age of the mill, as far as you know?
The mills, the mill, prospered through the teens and 20s, and then many mills shut down during Depression. They didn't make any money of significance, but they were able to keep the plant open during Depression. My father says he kept it open by prayer, and that each time he seemed like he couldn't make the payroll, something would happen and he'd be able to barely make the payroll. The Great Depression the country elected Delano Roosevelt in hoping that he could come up with approaches to break the Great Depression. And he established the conservation corps and other ways. It put about 3 million people to work, but unemployment never got below 15%, and at times it was high as 30 to 40%. And in fact, in 1937 and 8, they had a second depression or recession, where unemployment went up to about 38%, and the depression was never corrected until the Second World War. And it was the production that was demanded of our country in the Second World War that broke the depression. During the Second World War, the government controlled your profits, so the profits were low. But following the Second World War, when people had been under rations and couldn't buy things, and all the soldiers came back, got married, had children, and wanted to build houses and furnish their houses, the period from 1946 to 1950 was probably the golden age of the company. Then there were some struggles in the 50s, and in the 60s, from about 1960 to 1968, was another period of substantial profits. And when I speak of substantial profits, I think I need to be more exact. When I talk to young people today and ask them what they think a large manufacturing plant with 600 or 700 employees, what percent profit they would make, young people tell me 20, 25, and some of them 50%. In our golden days, we made between 3 and 4%. And in the more difficult days, we made from 0 to 1.5%. At Scottdale Mills, I never saw profits reach 4%. But they were adequate. As far as our family was concerned, our salaries were our primary financial return from the company. In some of the latter years, they were paying about $100,000 to $120,000 in dividends. As I said, I had about 2%. So my dividends from the mill on my stock were in the $2,000 to $3,000 range.
Okay. Now, you've mentioned that your family started and owned several mills, and also you mentioned Agnes Scott. Are there any other industries that your family was associated with?
At this point, I'm going to talk about my father's family. My father, in 1935, was asked to manage Whittier Mills that was owned by General Butler's estate in Boston, Massachusetts. General Butler was the Northern general that sacked New Orleans and is known to have stolen cotton and silver from the plantations around New Orleans. But he apparently took the wealth from the cotton and silver and he built 8 textile factories in the North. 8 or approximately 8. And then in 1895, he built Whittier Mills in Atlanta, which is on the northeast side of Atlanta on Bolton Road, where the Chattahoochee River exits under 285, next to the Chattahoochee Brick Company. It's in a section of Atlanta called Chattahoochee. This plant employed about 650 people. My father was given 1 share of stock so he could attend stockholders' meeting and put in charge of the mill. 20 years later, the board of directors in Massachusetts called him up and said, 20 years ago, when we put you in charge of Whittier Mills, we had 9 mills, 8 of them in New England. They were all making money, and we had 1 mill in Atlanta, Whittier Mills, that was losing money. We put you in charge, and today Whittier's making money, and all 8 of our mills in New England are losing money. He says, how would you explain it? My father said he didn't know. He certainly was not smarter than the people up there, nor better educated. But he says, I've sought to honor the Lord in my business, and he has blessed me. And 2 years later, 2 or 3 years later, they said they were going to shut the mill down and offered to sell it to him and his nephew, Hansford Sams. And they operated it for 11 years. They had 11 $100,000 bonds, and they paid off 9 of the $100,000 bonds, and due to the change in import laws, they had to shut it down after 11 years. But that was Whittier Mills that they were involved in. I spent 25 years paying off the debts and selling the property of Whittier Mills. More than half of my career was involved in working out that situation. Then Scottdale Mills, we've mentioned. My grandfather, George Booker Scott, bought up land east of Decatur and had a dairy farm where DeKalb Hospital is now located. And they provided the land for DeKalb Hospital at a very low price, $4,400 an acre, I believe, 40 acres, and gave them the land to extend North Decatur Road from Lawrenceville Highway through their property. And so they were selling off this land that they essentially or almost lost during the Depression. They gave the deeds to the banks they owed debt to, and the banks gave them back the deeds and said, you can manage it better than we can. And they eventually paid off their debts. Same thing happened with Scottdale stock. They had to give the stock to the banks. The bank gave it back to them and said, you can manage it better than we can. So they began selling this land off from the dairy farm after the Second World War I just completed that last year. The spinoff mill, Georgia Duck, the majority was bought by Milton Scott in the late 20s. The minority was owned by my father. And that mill was sold in 1998. And it was then resold to the British company, Finner Dunlop, who took the various components out of the mill and distributed them in 3 different locations around the country and shut the plant down and tore the building down last year in 2011. During the war, the government asked my father, Julius Scott, and Hansford Sams to start up another factory to increase the production of tent duck for small pup tents for the soldiers. And they went to Winder, Georgia, found an old warehouse and set up a weaving operation where the yarn or thread was shipped in from other plants, and they wove tent duck, or they set it up to weave tent duck. And about the time they got it going, Mr. Sams went into the Army, and so my father was left to run Scottdale, Whittier, and the Winder plant during the war, and his brother ran the duck mill, all of which were on war goods. So those would have been the only business that my family were involved in. George Washington Scott was heavily involved in real estate in downtown Atlanta. He built the first skyscraper in downtown Atlanta at Whitehall, and I'd have to look it up, but it was called the Century Building. I think it was 5 stories high. At his death, I've never checked this out. The newspaper said that he may have owned more property in downtown Atlanta than anyone else. I don't know what it is because I've never seen the income from it. I know of 2 parcels he owned. I know 3 parcels he owned. One was one of the corners at 5 Points. One was the property which now contains the Equitable building on Peachtree Street, and then this Century building. They're the only ones I know of that he owned. So he was in real estate and fertilizer and textiles.
Okay. Where exactly was the mill located?
The mill was located on the west side of East Ponce de Leon Avenue, 2.5 miles east of the courthouse in Decatur. North of the road Clarendon Avenue intersects Ponce de Leon at the point where the mill was located. The mill has been torn down, but the warehouses are still there and being rented to artisans.
Okay. And do you know why that particular site was chosen?
Well, the site was chosen because they already owned the property, and it was along that creek that they could get the water to run the boilers.
Okay. And do you know how much square footage the site occupied?
Well, the mill was on 16 acres of land. They did not include the village. George Washington Scott put his investments in what was called George W. Scott Investment Company, and he owned a lot of land. And the mill itself was on 16 acres. The village was probably on another 30 acres. And the building itself, at the time that we shut it down, there was 250,000 square feet, but its original building, it probably was more like 50 to 75,000 square feet.
I see that you have a photograph here. Would you mind describing the layout of the mill?
The mill ran east to west, and the original mill was this part right here that has the white roof. And these were the warehouses behind it. The railroad track came off parallel to Ponce de Leon and came in between the warehouses and the mill. And the main part of the manufacturing part of the mill were 2 floors, and this tower had a tank up there to pressurize the sprinkler system in case of a fire. Back here there was a well and another tank that provided water for the sprinkler system. This was the gin house. Where the farmers brought in their cotton on wagons. All the cotton originally, when the mill cranked up, was within wagon hauling distance, and it was ginned here. This was the boiler room, and this is smokestack for the boiler. And this little line here was a pipe running to the pond, which was down here to provide the water for the boilers. This was where the bales of cotton and the finished goods were stored. This building here was a cafeteria that had old Southern cooking, and the prices and the quality of the food was such that people from Decatur flocked out there, including the judges and the government people and the police. The lady that ran it was amazing. She ran the cafeteria, she ran an accounting business, she ran a farm and a boarding house. And whatever she managed, you didn't have to worry about.
Was she employed by the mill?
She was employed by the mill to run that, but these other things she did on her own. She lived down near what's now called Lake Lucerne. She had a little farm at Lake Lucerne. But back then it wasn't called Lake Lucerne. It was called can't remember the name, but it wasn't a pretty name. That's why they changed it to Lake Lucerne. But she had property right down there, about 5 acres or so.
So during lunchtime, you would have members of the community from outside the mill come to the mill to eat lunch.
And the cafeteria would prepare food, and we built a cart that could be pushed through the mill. This is before the days of vending machines. And since we had live steam, the cart was built to have water in it, and we would run this live steam in it till the water was 212 degrees. And then somebody would push it down the first floor and up the elevator and down the second floor. And the people that got it first, the food was a little hotter than the people that got it last. But that went through the mill maybe 6 times a day.
Okay, and
then later on, we put in vending machines and shut the cafeteria down. After we shut the cafeteria down, the Alcoholics Anonymous asked if they could use it, and they rented it. And they had 21 meetings a week for alcoholics to come and meet. They said they wanted their ideal was 28 meetings. They wanted a meeting 4 times a day to where no alcoholic could ever say there was not a time they could meet that was convenient. there would be corporate presidents, teenagers, and street people in those meetings.
Now, you've described the layout of the mill. Was that a standard layout for a textile mill, or was it more individualized for that?
Pretty much standard. Back in those days, they built multiple-story mills. In later time, to maximize the material handling, you would have only a single-floor mill on more acreage. But we would manufacture the thread on the top floor and then send the thread down and do the weaving on the bottom floor, and then ship it out to the inspection and warehouse area.
How were the buildings designed? And what I mean by that is, you mentioned earlier that in the beginning they used wood to construct.
Okay, I'm going to describe the architecture and how it changed through the years, not just for this mill, but for most mills in the South. Originally, the mills were built out of wood because steel wasn't available, or either wood was cheaper. But the bays in the mill were 25 foot wide, and the support beams going widthwise, they were 25 feet. Going lengthwise, there was a support post every 8 feet. So you had a lot of the plant occupied with these rows of posts, which was not ideal to moving product through the mill. But that's the way they were moved, they were handled. Then in the late 1920s, and this would have been in the late in the 1800s and into the early 1900s. By the late 1920s, somewhere around in the 1920s, they moved to a steel structure with brick walls. I call them curtain walls. The walls didn't support weight. In the wooden, when the structures were wood, the exterior walls were heavy brick walls, starting maybe 2.5 to 3 feet wide at the bottom and turning up, and they were load bearing. But when they put in a steel structure, the walls were not load bearing generally. The load was carried by the steel beams even around the periphery of the building. Then in the 50s and 60s, the structure went to single floors and steel buildings with wide bays instead of 25 feet up to 32 feet wide or wider. And instead of 8 feet between the posts, there would be 30 or 40 feet between the posts. And the curtain walls on the outside would be built with 2 layers of brick with about 4 inches of hollow space in the middle, which would be poured with insulation, vermiculite insulation, to help you hold the temperature and the humidity, which was essential to production. Different humidities for every department. And there would be extensive air conditioning systems throughout. Millions of dollars worth of air conditioning equipment. We could hold the temperature and humidity plus or minus 2 degrees anywhere in the plant. And we could change the air every 5 to 6 minutes and filter it.
Impressive. You mentioned that there was a village. Was the worker housing located, did it share the site with the mill, or was it located a little further away from the mill?
I need to go back and describe the culture and the economy of the time the mill was built, which explains the why of all of this. When the mill was built, there was no electricity. There was no county water. There was no county sewage. There was no automobiles. There were no paved roads, essentially, very few. Postulin was not paved. There were essentially no paved roads anywhere near. There were no streetcars. And there were no stores, no shopping centers, and no schools, no DeKalb County schools. The police department of DeKalb County consisted of one sheriff. And that was the environment in which George W. Scott and his son, George Booker Scott, built Scottdale Mills. So they had to build a mill to provide power, steam power, to operate it. The steam engine powered a big flywheel that powered a shaft running down the top floor and the bottom floor. And there were subshafts off the main shaft, and eventually there were belts that dropped down to every machine to power every machine in the plant. Since there was no transportation, the only way people could get to work was to walk. So the village had to be built within walking distance of the plant. And everybody that worked in the plant either had to walk or ride a horse to the plant. And in those days, essentially, everybody but the executives walked. My father, when he ran the mill, started running the mill in 1920, lived in Decatur, 2.5 miles away, and he rode a horse to work every day. He told me that in the cold weather, he would take a big heavy coat and hang it over the open fireplace till it got blazing hot, and then he would put it on and bolt it and button it up and get on his horse and ride to work even when it was 15, 20 degrees. So that's why the villages were built. The villages were a necessity. The villages were trouble for the management of the company. When people don't own their houses, things get damaged unnecessarily, and every time a screen door was kicked out, they would holler at the mill to send a carpenter down to fix it. After the invention of automobiles and transportation, more and more people came from greater distances, and in 1957 the company sold all the houses to the employees, offered them to the employees who were living in them. All but one bought them. The average price was $4,000 a house in 1957. The company arranged the financing with DeKalb Federal Savings and Loan, and the company guaranteed all the loans until 20% of the loan was paid back. In other words, no employee had to make a down payment. The company guaranteed the down payment to the DeKalb Savings and Loan, and then when 20% was paid off, DeKalb Savings and Loan canceled that guarantee, and everybody but one bought their own house. So in 1957, the village became a DeKalb County village. The same way, when the company was built, they had to provide housing. They arranged for a doctor to move in on Clarendon Avenue. His name was Dr. Allgood, and he spent his life there, 50 years, with the people in the community. I remember at his retirement dinner, my father gave a report, and he had done a study, and he said, "Well, doctor, it looks like you signed 5,000 death certificates and 5,000 birth certificates. I'm hard-pressed to see where you did much good." Also, after, I think around 1905 or 10, the company hired a nurse and set up a clinic for the people in the village, and they had a dentist to come by once a week. they gave the land and built a school and stocked with teachers and had to build a home for the teachers. And then in I think 1923, DeKalb County set up the school system and started building grammar schools, and they built Scottdale Grammar School and Avondale Grammar School, and I think Clarkston and others, and people in the village went to the Scottdale Grammar School. Back in those days, it was segregation, and I think they built in the black community, the school is now called Robert Shaw, and later Hamilton High School. But the initial years of the mill were all segregated.
Can you describe what the worker housing looked like?
The worker housing initially were a house with basically 4 rooms and a back porch with a rail on which would be a wash basin. There would be a well in the back of each house and an outhouse and a black pot in the backyard where you'd build a fire under it and boil your clothes in it for washing. Later on, and there would be a fireplace in each house. Later on, the mill, I can remember this happening when I was a little boy. They underpinned the houses with concrete block or brick to make them warmer. And at about the same time, they put bathrooms in each house and did away with outhouses. In 1957, when the houses were sold to the people, you could see people's personalities came out. Instead of them all being painted mill white, people would paint them the colors they liked. Somebody would add a carport or a garage. Somebody would add an extra room. And they just began to take the personalities of the owner.
What types of equipment were used at the mill?
Well, the mill initially took the cotton from the farmers, ran it through the gin to remove the seeds, bought it from the farmers, and processed it with an opening room where you would open the bale and begin to blend the bales to have a consistent flow of cotton. And then you would do a preparation called a picker room, and you would go into a card room where you would comb out the short staples and most of the trash. And then it would go through 2 stages of drawing where you would pull the fibers beside each other to make them parallel, and both pull in one direction and another direction, make the fibers parallel. Then it would go through 1 or 2 processes to reduce the bulk from about 1 inch in diameter of loose cotton down to various sizes to prepare it for spinning. That process was called fly frames or roving frames, R-O-V-I-N-G. Then the cotton would go into a spinning frame, and the spinning frame would have a drafting section that would have rollers going successively faster to reduce the bulk and then put the twist in it to give it the strength and wrap it on a bobbin. At that point, then, you split up to make the thread for the lengthwise threads in a loom, called the warp, and the crosswise threads that go in the shuttle, which is called the filling. Literary people call it the woof, the warp and the woof. I never heard the word woof ever used in a textile mill. It was the warp and the filling because the filling filled in the thing. The warp would be put from 1,000 to 5,000 threads across the width of the loom, and you'd make it as long as you could, but it would have to go through a starching operation to make it stiff and to where it wouldn't fray up and would be stronger in the weaving. So it would be dipped in the starch and then dried to an exact 6% moisture regain. And from there, it would, to start a new style, you would draw it in through the stop wires, the harness, and the reed, thread by thread. Whether it's 5,000, a person had to bring everyone through. Once you had that pattern on the loom, you had a machine called a tie-in machine, and this machine could go through and tie those 5,000 knots in about 30 minutes. Then you'd weave it, and different settings on the loom would weave different types of fabrics. You would take it off and about 100-pound, 50 to 100-pound rolls, and take it to the cloth room and inspect it, repair it where possible, grade it, bale it up, and put it in the warehouse and ship it. We did not have any finishing. This was called gray goods, G-R-I-E-G-E, the French word meaning raw. We made textile gray goods in this plant and shipped it off to other finishing plants or sold it to people who took it to finishing plants to finish the fabric.
During the time that you were at the mill, were there many competitors?
The country was full of competitors. It was highly competitive. I said we never made, at our best years, we made approaching 4% profit. But it was a highly, highly competitive industry, as has finally destroyed the industry, as the international competition has taken it away from us. There's almost no textile industry left in America.
The employees of the mill, did some of them come from these other mills?
Yes. Initially, not so much, but when I was there, we recruited as much as we could from other mills, but during my early days in the 50s and 60s and early 70s, the hardest problem we had was finding employees for the work. We were a low-wage industry, but we were steady work, and the checks always cleared the bank. And so if we had been out in the country, we would have been much better off because it would have been easier to get employees. There'd be less competition. But we were in metropolitan Atlanta, and in much of that time in the 50s and 60s, unemployment was around 4%, 4 to 5%. And in many cases, because our wages were low, we would be people's last choice. And during the early 70s or mid 70s, we began to recruit heavily from the inner city of Atlanta, and which is was the most difficult area to train people to work. Many of the people had never learned discipline at home, never learned discipline at school. Many of them were dropouts from the juvenile court system. And then we got our opportunity. And we made many mistakes, but we finally developed a training system that could effectively train the inner city workers. 3 times congressmen came to us and asked us what we were doing that other people weren't. And we would try to tell them, and once they realized it was very, very hard work, they never called back. They were obviously looking for something they could throw a pile of money at and get a big headline. How effective were we? We got to where we could take a class of 40 trainees, and I could guarantee the president of the company that we could train them and have them on the jobs at standard work production and standard quality in 8 weeks, with 50% of them making it and 50% of them gone. So out of a class of 40, we could get 20 employees. And the 50% that we lost, most of them were lost within the first 10 days. We could guarantee inner city young people 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, that we could have them earning a regular paycheck in 8 weeks. We would not ask them their educational record. We would not eliminate them for their criminal record, although we would never hire anyone that we knew to be a sex offender. I don't mean immoral. I mean a sex criminal. But I've hired robbers, burglars, and murderers. But that we would only require, that we would guarantee them that they could be running a job in 8 weeks if they give us 2 things. Cooperate with the people, train them to do the work they didn't know how to do. It was never a problem. There wouldn't be 5 people out of 1,000. The second thing was they had to come to work regular and on time. We told them that we thought we were very smart and very good at training, but we had never learned how to work anybody that wasn't there. We weren't that smart. And that was the problem. There was no lack of ability. They had the same range of capabilities as anybody else, but it was the discipline. And we learned at very great difficulty how to break the discipline. We finally realized that it was a little bit like the wild horses or Mustangs out on the western plain. They run free. They're undisciplined. The cowboy catches them. He puts them in a corral. He does something called breaking the horse. Whatever he did, he called it breaking the horse. And after that, that horse could be used for any meaningful work that they needed the horse to do. And we realized that we were breaking horses. And some of them were great people, but they had never learned discipline, and we did the hard work of breaking the horse. And once they trained at our place, they could go to work anywhere else. We told them, if you go through our training and work for us, if you get a better job and give us 1 week notice, we will give you an excellent reputation, and we'll give you an excellent recommendation and send you off with our blessings. We put through the plant in training, took into training in those years somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 people. And I've sometimes wondered, who's breaking horses today? You know, all of our type of jobs have been exported out of the country, which at that time I fought with all that I could. I lobbied, I worked with the industry to try to get Congress not to open up free trade. Today I'm not sure that it isn't best, but I sure didn't think so at the time, and our country has lost a lot because of it, and part of the struggle now of people not having jobs is related to the fact that we're no longer a powerful industrial nation. In my working days, I never worked with an individual person who was poor or unemployed or desperate that I couldn't offer a job if they would come to work regular and on time and cooperate with the trainers. Today I can't do that, and that's a real loss. I work with a lot of people in my church that have struggles. I go to a multicultural church. I'm a minority in my church. I'm among the minority. And I am sad that I cannot help people find work as I could when I was running textile factories. We eventually solved our worker problem with the refugees. And I would have to say that we then did not emphasize hiring out of the inner city because the refugees were much easier to train and work longer. We hired at one time 66 Laotians in one group. Our training program was so good that we could train even people that couldn't speak English. Of the 66, only 2 spoke English. And we put them to work, and in the first 6 weeks they worked, out of the whole crowd, we only had 2 people absent for a total of 2 days out of 66 employees.
Wow.
Then later we needed more employees. We hired another group of Laotians, 25 in that group. It was an utter failure. We lost 25 out of 25. And we did a research project to see why. The first group were from the lowland people who had 50 years exposure to missionaries and the American military, and were used to mechanization, and were used to working at night. The second group were mountain people who had never worked at night and had never been exposed to mechanization. We found that they would have to get jobs in America in landscaping or fishing or things of that nature, but they were